In a new interview out this morning, former FBI Director James Comey criticizes President Trump's relationship with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin.
Even in a meeting with 3 people in the Oval Office, he is arguing that he gave a good answer when he said, essentially, we are the same kind of killers that Putin's thugs are. And that struck me, because I can understand why a president might want to. It's important to have a good relationship, even with adversaries. Why a president might not want to criticize publicly another leader. But privately, sitting with the person in charge of countering the Russia threat in the United States, privately not being willing to do that, that always struck me.
In another interview last night, Comey said that it's possible the Russians have compromising information on President Trump. So with more on Comey's comments, we want to bring in CBS News legal analyst Ricky Kleeman. Thanks for joining us, Ricky.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.
So the president tweeted this morning. Here's what he had to say. Comey drafted the crooked Hillary exoneration long before he talked to her, in brackets, lied in Congress to Senator G, then based his decisions on her poll numbers. Disgruntled, he, McCabe, and others committed many crimes. Not the first time the president has suggested that James Comey has broken the law, has lied under oath, and all this sort of thing. Is that the case? Has Jim Comey broken the law, from what we know?
I don't think he's broken the law. I think that you do have a question of the ethical violation, if there is one, of his leaking his memos through his friend to the New York Times, which were the contemporaneous memos he claims that he made after conversations with President Trump.
But why is that called a leak, out of curiosity? If he shares some notes that he made, why is it a leak?
Because it's the property of the FBI. By the way, there's nothing classified in those memos. Now, if he had leaked, quote unquote, classified memos, that would not be legal, but that is not what happened. The other thing that I think perhaps investigators or people who have been involved in the criminal justice system, whether as an agent or in my case, as both a prosecutor and a defense lawyer, would know is this. It is not unusual in the slightest for a prosecutor to have finalized their opinion about an investigation when the only thing waiting is the testimony or the interview with the principal. The same could be said, if we look at it, fair is fair in love and war. If we look at it today, the special prosecutor could make a decision of whether or not there is obstruction of justice or whether or not there is collusion and write it all down as a report to Congress before any interview with President Trump. Then you would add to it or subtract it from it based on that interview, or in the case of President Trump, highly unlikely that there will be an interview. So I don't have a problem with that either.
Right. Comey was also asked about the possibility of the president firing Special Counsel Robert Mueller, Special Investigator Robert Mueller. Let's take a listen to that.
It would, I hope, set off alarm bells that this is his most serious attack yet on the rule of law. And it would be something that our entire country, again, Democrats and Republicans, that is higher than all the normal fights about policy. And it would be to the everlasting shame of partisans if they were unable to see that higher level and to protect it.
Your take on his assessment?
I think his assessment is 100% correct. And I think that that is also the feeling of many Democrats and Republicans, both in the populace and on the Hill. The rule of law must be respected at all times. The best thing that President Trump could do is let this investigation take its course, and it will end. Whether or not it ends with something bad happening to the president is anybody's guess. But the idea of creating a constitutional crisis by firing either Ron Rosenstein or ultimately having someone fire the special prosecutor will do the president no good. We have to remember that much of this investigation gets propelled by comments by the president or tweets by the president instead of it going into a state of remission.
Right, exactly. You know, James Comey sort of sniffed around the idea of obstruction of justice. He doesn't say that he believes that the president is guilty of it, but he says, you know, something to the effect that there were certainly some indications of something around that area. You know, what's your take on that interview? Could you see an obstruction of justice case forming?
I'm right where I was at the time that Mr. Comey was interviewed before the Congressional Committee, which is that it is kind of the specter, or as you say, the smell. There is certainly no evidence at this point in the public domain, this is just my opinion, that we have a full-blown obstruction case. What he said last night on the interview is the same as what he told Congress, is when he said that the president's asking him to go easy on Mr. Flynn, that General Flynn was a good person, and to go easy, go slow, that whichever were the exact words. He got a little stronger last night, that he heard it as a directive. He wasn't quite as strong in his testimony before Congress, but even last night, he said it could be evidence of part of an obstruction case, that in and of itself, it was not obstruction.
Yeah, he was definitely couching his words. I want to switch gears just a little bit and talk about the president's personal attorney, Michael Cohen. As everyone knows, the FBI raided his office and his houses. And now President Trump's legal team has filed a letter asking a federal judge to stop the review of materials seized from his personal attorney's offices and grounds. Give me the argument here in favor and against.
Well, the president really cannot ask for this to stop. He is one client. I assume that Michael Cohen has other clients, but he is one client, and it is not up to him to make this determination. Where we are is where we would be in any situation of a lawyer's records being seized. The judge, and this is going to be before Kimber Wood, Judge Wood in the Federal District Court in the Southern District, that's in Manhattan, to this afternoon, is going to look at the arguments on both sides of this case. Now, not everything that is seized in a lawyer's office is privilege. You can go to a lawyer for various things without seeking legal advice from that lawyer. In Michael Cohen's particular case, I assume that much of the dealings he had with President Trump may have been business dealings and not legal dealings. Now, when something falls into the privilege pile, the privilege pile is not to be shared with investigators looking for evidence unless the judge or someone appointed by the judge, or what we call a clean team or a taint team, is allowed to look at the documents and say what is privileged and what is not. But what can pierce the privilege is if the attorney is involved with the client in either a crime or fraud. The crime-fraud exception kills the privilege. But short of that, things that are privileged will not be disclosed and they will not be disseminated.
Do you think Michael Cohen sort of shot himself in the foot a little bit by saying on the record that he considers himself a fixer for the president?
Well, it doesn't help.
Right.
And a lot of things Michael Cohen has said publicly don't help. Not only does he say that he's a fixer, and he empowered his friend and perhaps one of his attorneys, David Schwartz, to go all over the airwaves and say that Michael Cohen is a fixer and has been for the last decade for President Trump, then Mr. Trump. But he's a fixer. Michael Cohen likens himself to Ray Donovan, which I just find appalling,
right,
albeit that I love the show. But Ray Donovan carries a baseball bat in the trunk of his car, lest we forget.
Right, indeed. Ricky Kleeman, thank you very much. Well, French President Emmanuel Macron is